Hey, hey everyone. Good to see you all. And welcome to AOS Colloquium. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. And it's the type of speaker, Abby Swann, who is the kind that would be enough for me to come out of hiding from sabbatical and actually show up to Colloquium. So you need an esteemed speaker to do that. And I'm so happy that we have one of those today. Just by way of introduction, Abby Swann runs the Eco Climate Lab, and as you know, I call my lab the Eco Meteorology Lab. So in many ways, it's a yin and yang kind of thing, and the types of things we think about in terms of the role of vegetation and ecosystems on weather and climate processes. Abby's taken a perspective that's in some ways similar, but in some ways different, and looking, as we'll see in her talk, on kind of large-scale dynamics and climates. And she's one of my favorite authors to assign in my bioclimatology class, because many of the papers she writes are eye-opening and creative, and not to mention also well-written. So Abby got her undergraduate degree at UC Berkeley in Earth and Planetary Science in 2003, and a master's in Earth and Environmental Sciences in Columbia. And then she came back to Berkeley to do her PhD with Professor Inez Fung, and she did that in 2010. After a postdoc at Harvard, she joined the faculty at the University of Washington in 2012, where she's been since. She just completed a sabbatical leave, and now she's back in the action. During the last couple of years, she's had a number of accolades, including being awarded an NSF Career Award, becoming a fellow of the Kavli Frontiers of Science, and more recently, the AGU Global Environmental Change Early Career Award. And this is reflective of the body of her work, including nearly 3 dozen or more publications on a variety of topics in climate and ecosystem feedbacks and interactions. So I'm looking forward to what we'll learn today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Abby Swann.
Thank you. Thanks for such a kind introduction, Ankur. And I'm excited to be with all of you here today. I'm going to sort out the tech side of this to start with. Okay. Hopefully you are all seeing my slides now.
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to talk today about quantifying the role that ecosystems play, terrestrial ecosystems in particular, in Earth's climate. And I'll bring up, I'll bring up some co-authors as we go along here. There are many. And funding for this work has come from a number of different grants, primarily from the National Science Foundation, but also from the Department of Energy. So I wanted to start by showing this image in the background, which is a satellite metric of plant activity from space. So it's called the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And this is an image from June. So it's summertime in the Northern Hemisphere. And I like to start with this image because it shows really obviously that plants care about climate. You can just see an imprint of climate on the activity of vegetation. Vegetation is very green and active in places with good growing conditions. And in places with really harsh growing conditions, say the deserts, you can see that there's not very much green vegetation. It also gives you a sense of the scale of the problem that I'm thinking about. I'm really interested in what role plants are playing at this global scale, but that requires thinking about what's happening with plants at much smaller scales as well. So I'm interested not only in how climate impacts plants, how plants care about their growing conditions, but also about how plants can impact climate. So how the distribution of what kinds of plants are growing where and how they're functioning matters for climate. So I'd say the really overarching theme in my research is where and how do plants influence climate? To dig into that problem a little bit more, I'm going to introduce the terrestrial surface energy budget, and we're going to use this as the framework for thinking about what plants are doing in the climate system, because this is the way that plants are actually interacting with the atmosphere. So plants can interact with climate through these 4 terms of the surface energy budget, also through fluxes of other constituents like carbon dioxide, but today we're going to focus mostly on energy and water. So if we walk through each of these, I'm going to talk a little bit about how plants can influence each term. Starting on the left with shortwave radiation, plants can alter the surface albedo. So that's how much of the sunlight gets absorbed at the surface. And different plants reflect different amounts of sunlight. This is something that might be really obvious to some people and maybe to others, like me earlier in my career, was not so obvious. This is a picture taken in Alaska showing two main plant types with very different albedos. On the hillside in the background, you can in particular see there's a really bright swath of these broadleaf trees, these flatleaf trees, and the rest of the hillside is quite dark, and those are those needle-leaf spruce trees. So these two different tree varieties have really different surface albedos. It would matter which one of them you have growing in a place, how much of the sunlight would get absorbed. Plants can also influence long-wave radiation fluxes. They do this mostly indirectly by changing the amount of carbon dioxide or water vapor or the profile of temperature in the atmosphere in some other way. That alters the downwelling long-wave radiation fluxes. And then the upwelling fluxes are just a function of the surface temperature. So they kind of follow whatever the surface temperature ends up being. The two terms on the right are the turbulent heat fluxes. And plants can alter those. One way is through changing the surface roughness. So taller statured vegetation creates a rougher surface. And this can impact how effectively turbulent fluxes can be moved from the surface to the atmosphere. That's particularly important, say, for a sensible heat flux, which then goes as the gradient of temperature between the surface and the atmosphere. So plants can alter the roughness. And finally, if we think about latent heat fluxes, those are actually split into multiple components on land, some just evaporation, say off the soil or off of the plants if they pool water on the leaves, and otherwise transpiration, which is a water flux that actually goes through the plant. And so plants have a really direct control over that flux, which is going to alter this latent heat flux, which is important for the surface energy budget. So let's dig into that transpiration flux a little bit more. What's going on there? Well, plants have leaves, and on those leaves, they have stomata. And stomata are valves that can open and close to allow gas exchange between the atmosphere and the interior of the plant. And the reason plants want to exchange gas with the atmosphere is that they need to get carbon dioxide in order to run photosynthesis. So they've got to get CO2 out of the atmosphere. And when they open their stomata in order to get CO2, they lose water. Water is saturated inside the air inside the plant is saturated with water vapor. And so water is going to move from inside the plant to outside the plant. And that flux is called transpiration. And what's important here is that these two processes are coupled through the opening and closing of stomata. So as carbon goes into the plant, water comes out. And that means that this water flux, this surface energy budget, are really tied to what plants are doing in terms of photosynthesis. How many leaves they have, how they're photosynthesizing, how they open and close those stomata. So these biological processes are very tied to the energy fluxes. So if we come back to our surface energy budget, we can think about how a change in plants, change in where they grow, how they're functioning, et cetera, can alter these terms in the surface energy budget. And by altering any of these terms, the surface energy budget must still balance. And so that will cause a rebalancing, a repartitioning of energy, which can have consequences for near surface climate. So I'm going to talk about two different stories today. First, on the theme of the climate impacts of which plants grow where. And second, on the theme of the climate impacts of how plants respond to a changing climate. So we'll look at some evidence along each of these stories to think about what plants are doing and what the climate impacts of these plant processes are. I'm going to tell you a little bit about methods in general first. So for a lot of the work I do, I use Earth system models. Not all, but for much of it, we use Earth system models, and often the community Earth system model if we're running our own experiments. So an Earth system model is a simulation machinery that represents the fluid dynamics in the atmosphere, cloud processes, radiation, as well as some representation of ocean, transport of heat in particular, and land processes. And so many components are in these models. We're going to dig just for a second into what's in the land, not to look at the details, but just to show you that many things are represented in terms of processes on land. So that allows us to look at what those land assumptions about the land are doing to the climate system. So just for an example, here are the processes represented in the community land model, which is part of the community earth system model. And the details aren't important other than to say that on the left, we have surface energy fluxes. Those are representing those that surface energy budget, essentially. In the middle, we have hydrologic fluxes, so water going in and out of the land surface. And on the right, we have carbon. So carbon going in through photosynthesis, coming out through respiration, et cetera. So there's a lot to keep track of in terms of what's going on the land surface. So what do we do to actually run these experiments? Well, a lot of our simulations are asking theoretical questions. So experiments like what happens when we change where plants are growing? Or what happens when we change just a surface property like the albedo of the surface? And we can run a set of simulations that allow us to isolate that signal. So take a control world and then one where we just change one thing, say the distribution of plants. And we can figure out what arose differently in the climate system because of that one change. This allows us to more specifically isolate the signals associated with that. And for a lot of our experiments, we use a flab ocean, although not necessarily all of them. I think all the ones today I'll show you have a simplified ocean we call slab ocean. This allows the atmosphere to deviate from just being constrained to exactly what the surface temperatures of the ocean are. Okay, so for our first science story, we're going to discuss the climate impacts of which plants grow where. And this is work that was led by Marisa Legou when she was a graduate student with me at the University of Washington. We're going to look at some experiments she ran where we add more and more and more trees. So we're going to clobber Earth with a lot of extra trees in the mid-latitudes. And we're going to look at what happens, and we're going to look at how it scales with how many trees we've added. So like I said, we take this Earth system model, and we do what if kind of theoretical experiments. So this is a map showing you where we're going to add all of those trees. And we have taken all of the grass cover in the northern hemisphere mid-latitudes between 30 degrees north and 60 degrees north, and we've turned them into one kind of tree, a broadleaf deciduous tree. So it has this spatial pattern. This is where all those grasses were, in red colors being more area converted into trees. And this is going to be our biggest experiment. We can call this the sledgehammer. This is going to be the place where we are going to add lots and lots and lots of trees. And then we're going to scale back from this by adding incrementally from all grass to all trees and look at how our responses scale with that adding of trees. So first, we can think about how adding these trees is going to alter the surface energy budget. It's going to alter those terms. How did it change when we added trees? Well, as we added more tree cover, we go from across the x-axis from the least amount of trees added to the most amount of trees added on the right. We can see that the absorbed shortwave radiation by the surface goes up, the extra absorbed shortwave radiation. So when we add the sledgehammer amount of trees, which is the largest bar on the right, we're absorbing about 4 watts per meter squared more energy across the northern hemisphere mid-latitude land area. And this scales relatively smoothly with the addition of tree area. So more trees make for a darker surface because they're darker than the grasses they're replacing, and they therefore absorb more sunlight. Okay, so we've added energy through the shortwave radiation term, and now we've got to see what happens to the system. How is that energy going to get back out of the land surface? Because the surface energy budget still has to balance. So we put more energy in with shortwave radiation. Where is it going to come out? Well, the first place you might guess it would come out is through latent heat fluxes. So more energy in, you can evaporate more water to get rid of that extra energy. And at first, for our first 2 experiments, we see that there is, in fact, more water evaporated. So we add more trees. You can imagine this is sort of creating more pipelines for water to get from the soil into the atmosphere. So adding mid-latitude trees makes the surface darker, and we get more water flux. But this actually only happens for the first 2 experiments. After those first 2 experiments, we see that the system maxes out. and it's getting rid of all the extra water that it had, and it can no longer continue to get rid of that extra energy by evaporating water. So we're calling that limited by water. It still has extra water initially, but it's using up all that extra water, and that's not enough to get rid of all of the extra energy. So there's this threshold response. At first, latent heat fluxes increase, but then they just stay steady as you add more and more trees. So this change in evapotranspiration, it depends on the water availability, not just on the number of trees that were added. And there's this switch between a system that has extra water and a system that doesn't have extra water. And remember that that amount of energy we're adding kept going up. So there seems to be this threshold, plus now the system we know in these experiments where it has really a lot of trees, the most trees, there's still extra energy that needs to get out somehow. And so if we look at our surface energy budget, we absorb more solar radiation in the left-hand term, and we're not able to get rid of enough water to get rid of all that extra energy through latent heat fluxes. That means it's got to come out through these other terms, through sensible heating and long-wave radiation. And both of these terms are a function of surface temperature. Long-wave radiation is just the sigma t to the fourth in terms of releasing energy through as the temperature goes up, and the sensible heat fluxes go up as the gradient of temperature between the surface and the atmosphere. So essentially, in order to get more energy out through those two terms, surface temperature has to increase. So now we have a surface climate signal associated with this perturbation to the surface energy budget. And in fact, this is what we see in our series of simulations. The darkest green bars are the latent heat fluxes. Remember, they increase for the first two simulations, and then they stay flat as we keep adding more trees. But the outgoing long wave in the medium green and the sensible heating in the lightest green continue to take up the slack. So they get rid of the extra energy. And as we know, that is associated with an increase in surface temperature. So the system has these kind of two regimes, one where latent heat fluxes take care of the extra energy and we don't get a change in surface temperature, and another where latent heat flux is maxed out and we have to get rid of the energy through sensible heating and long wave radiation, and that is associated with an increase in temperature. So to summarize just this first point, as we add more and more trees in the Northern Hemisphere mid-latitudes, we see that local climate has a threshold response. It depends on the local water balance. And it's controlled by this switch between latent heat and sensible heat and getting rid of that extra energy. And on the one hand, we could say this is encouraging. We're sort of understanding those two regimes in the system, but also challenging because we don't necessarily model the water availability at very accurately over large scales. It's a very challenging problem in terms of knowing enough about all the soil properties and depths and even how to model that system. So knowing what the local water balance should be at any point in time or in space is actually quite challenging. But its more universal concept would be how that there's two behaviors of the system, and we can guess what we think would happen when you have extra water and when you don't have extra water. Did I see there was a question?
Yeah, Abby, John Martin here. If you warm the mid-latitudes in the places where you put the trees, does that push the polar jet poleward and therefore the storm track poleward, and therefore you have a reduction in the likelihood of replenishing the local water supply?
That's a good question. I'm not going to address it directly, except that my next step is to talk about what happens to much larger scale circulation.
Okay, thanks.
And to show a bit about how this actually also changes global scale patterns of circulation. So what about climate at broader scales? So we're going to look into that next. And I'm going to start by just orienting everybody to thinking about tropical rainfall. So before we get into polar jets, let's look at what happens in the tropics. So this is a satellite image of the intertropical convergence zone. And this is a sort of giving you the more realistic picture of what rainfall can look like in the tropics. It has a strong linear feature where the two branches of the Hadley circulation come together, air rises, and we get intense rainfall in big cloud cover in this sort of linear feature. I'm going to show you next what it looks like in these climate model simulations, which does not perfectly match reality, but it's what we're going to be the baseline from which we're comparing. So this is the annual mean rainfall in these simulations. And you can see that there is intense features of precipitation in the tropics that have these sort of linear appearances. So that is our modeled intertropical convergence zone. And what we're going to look at next is how this global rainfall pattern changes when we add trees. So remember those same tree pattern, adding it to the northern hemisphere mid-latitudes, and we're going to see how it impacts where it's raining across the globe. So I'll show you now the change in the rainfall pattern. So this is the mean, and then now we're looking at the change. And in blue places, it's getting wetter than it was in the control case. And so this is, we add the trees and it gets wetter. And in red places, it's getting drier. And you can see, particularly in the tropics, that we have this kind of blue feature above a red feature, or a shift in that intertropical convergence zone to the north. So we got more rain on the northern edge of it and less rain on the southern edge of it. You can also see changes in rainfall patterns elsewhere, and we can get into at a different time in a conversation of what other circulation effects there are. But I'm going to talk now about why is the tropical rainfall changing. And this idea that mid-latitude trees are making it rain in different places in the tropics. So what's the mechanism? Well, this is our hypothesis, and this is based on also corroborated by work by many others who've looked at other types of forcing that initiate a shift in the intertropical convergence zone. So Chang and Bitts, Broccoli et al., Sarah Kang, Dargan Frierson, et cetera. And so we're looking at a similar type of response of the climate system, but forced by an addition of tree cover. So this is our diagram of the Hadley circulation. We have the two branches, one in the northern hemisphere, one in the southern hemisphere. And at the meeting of those two branches of the Hadley circulation, we have intense rainfall at the intertropical convergence zone. We've now taken trees and added them to the northern hemisphere mid-latitude, so between 30 degrees and 60 degrees north. And by adding those trees, we put an energy source in the northern hemisphere. So we stuck a bunch of dark stuff on the surface and it absorbed sunlight. So we saw that there was more sunlight absorbed as we added more trees. And so this creates a gradient in energy, and moist static energy specifically. And now we've set up this gradient in energy. And the resulting move of the atmosphere is to shift the Hadley circulation to the north. And this is in order to increase the transport of heat from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere. So we put extra energy in the northern hemisphere. The Hadley circulation is working to move that energy back across the equator to the southern hemisphere. It does so in this upper branch of the cell on the southern hemisphere side. So by shifting the Hadley circulation, the atmosphere can redistribute that energy back to the other side. Associated with this, the intertropical convergence zone moves along with the Hadley circulation, and that causes a shift in the rainfall pattern to the north. And so, as I said, many people have looked at this in the context of other forcing mechanisms, ice sheets, aerosols, just adding anomalous blobs of heat, and found this type of behavior in the response of the atmosphere. One of the things that we thought was really interesting in this particular case is that we've changed trees. So we've changed where trees are growing. They've initiated this circulation response, and that this actually impacts plants elsewhere. So the intertropical convergence zone moving, or these changes in rainfall patterns, actually influence tropical plants because they respond to those changes in rainfall. So I'll show you a map of plant productivity across the globe as we add the large amount of trees. And we find, sure, we get increases in plant productivity in the mid-latitudes where we've added a lot of tree cover, but we also see changes in plant productivity in the tropics where we didn't modify the plants at all. And they're responding to this change in water availability. So I put a little inset map of precipitation there just to the left of South America. And you can see that places that got more productive with more photosynthesis have wetter conditions, and places where you see a drop in photosynthesis had drier conditions. So this rainfall ends up mattering for plants. And so adding trees in the mid-latitudes ends up modifying how plants are, how productive plants are in the tropics. This is an interesting sort of plant-atmosphere-plant connection, or as we've been calling it, an ecoclimate teleconnection. And so how does this mechanism scale as we add more and more trees? So I've been showing you these maps, which are from really adding a lot of trees. If we come back to our series of experiments where we add incrementally more trees, we can see how this circulation shifts. So this along the x-axis again is adding more and more trees. On the y-axis, we have the extra energy that's being moved across the equator from north to south. And we think of this as this is really what the atmosphere is trying to accomplish with that circulation shift. So it's giving us a sense of how much circulation shift is achieving in terms of redistributing that energy. And we see that the circulation is responding semi-linearly to the addition of trees. It does keep going up as we add more and more tree cover, maybe not super uniformly, but we're seeing in general that there's not a threshold response. It doesn't flatten out the way that the local climate response does. The energy flux continues to increase as we add more and more tree cover. So to summarize this point, the global climate has this linear response. The circulation is responding to these large-scale energy gradients. Really, the fact that we added an energy source in the northern hemisphere, it's not concerned about whether or not the surface temperature went up. It's just concerned about the fact that there was a gradient in moist static energy, and so that's controlled by the surface albedo. And so that gives a different character to this large-scale climate response to a change in forest cover than we see at the smaller scale. So we were interested in how to break this apart more. We've got the local response sort of controlled by whether the effects of latent heating or sensible heating dominate, and the large-scale response is controlled by what's happening with the surface albedo. We really wanted to be able to create experiments where we could test, well, how much is really responsible for one of these factors, like just changing surface albedo or just changing the evaporative resistance, which would shift your balance between latent and sensible heating. And it turns out that's a kind of hard thing to do, figuring out what the climate response is to these specific factors of changing forest cover. Typical land surface models I showed you have lots of arrows in those diagrams representing everything that's going on. And so it's actually pretty hard to go in and ask a simple question like, what is the role of changing surface albedo by itself? So in order to answer this question, we actually created our own very simple land model to test how the atmosphere responds to changes in the surface. And we think of it, and I say we, this was led by Marisa Legou. We also did this in collaboration with Gordon Bonin. This is really Marisa's creation. And it's kind of like an aquaplanet for land. So this is a figure from Manabe and Bryan, 1969, and our land model is not so dissimilar from what they had in that paper. Very, very simple land, basically a resolving of the surface energy budget that allows us to ask what the atmosphere cares about in a more directed and constrained way. So what does this model look like? Well, we have a couple of layers for soil temperature in order to calculate the soil surface temperature. We have a bucket for hydrology. We have just an evaporative resistance that can be specified for the lid of that bucket. We specify the surface albedo, and we specify the surface roughness. So this is about as simple as we thought we could make it. And we've coupled it into the community earth system model in place of where the typical land model would go. So we can look at it coupled to the same atmosphere and think about how that atmosphere responds just to, say, a change in surface albedo. So we think this is a useful tool for asking a number of different questions. I'll show you just a very brief preview of what we've started to look at. And Marisa continues to do interesting things with it. This is also something that's available through the community earth system model if you think it'd be interesting for one of your experiments. It's something that can be turned on now, and Marisa's working with a software engineer to make it one of the comp sets that make it very easy to use. So if this looks like it would work for your problem, you should reach out and let us know. So what Marisa looked at first is to think about what is the temperature response to changing just one factor, the surface albedo. So this is a map of how much temperature changes if you make the surface darker by 0.1 albedo units. So uniform change in albedo, how much warmer does the surface get when you make it darker? And the first thing to notice is that it gets warmer just about everywhere, but that it gets bigger temperature change in some places than others. In particular, you can see there's more temperature change in places that are probably a little bit drier. That makes sense from what we saw in the first part of the talk, right? You get more temperature change if you don't have water available to just get that extra energy out through latent heat fluxes. You'll also note that these colors are a little bit washed out. And what I'm showing you is just if you recalculate the surface energy budget for the land. So if I just consider the land in isolation and we make it darker, it absorbs more sunlight, what happens to the surface temperature? But in much of our work, we're trying to think about how the coupled Earth system works, the whole thing, all the pieces coupled together. So we really want to know what happens when you have an atmosphere on top of this. Do you get the same answer when you change the land surface? And so we did that experiment also, and that's shown on the right. And the first answer is no, you get a lot more temperature change when you allow the atmosphere to respond. So the atmosphere can respond by changing the profile of temperature, which changes the long wave radiation back down. It can also respond by changing cloud cover or water vapor, which can alter solar radiation coming into the surface. And so we see a lot more temperature change from allowing the atmosphere to respond. And we're calling this additional temperature change the feedback of the atmosphere in enhancing the warming at the surface. You can also see it changes the spatial pattern a little bit, partly due to potentially modifying cloud cover and other things. So it's not just about exactly how much water you have in the land surface. There's other things we have to consider about what's happening in the atmosphere. So this is the main point I just want to make here, is that the feedback from the atmosphere is really large. I'll show you one more plot along those lines. This is just calculating how much of the total response when you allow the system to be coupled is coming just from allowing the atmosphere to respond. And it's more than 50% just about everywhere on land. So the signal of temperature change you would expect from making the surface darker is got a huge component, which is coming from allowing the atmosphere to respond to that change in surface temperature. And my takeaway point there is really just that we really need to be considering a coupled land surface atmosphere system if we want to think about what the impacts of any changes on the land surface are on climate. We can't think about the land surface in isolation. So these atmospheric feedbacks are large, and we can't quantify the impact of the land surface, say from land use change, without including the atmosphere. So we'll take a deep breath here, and I'd like to move on and talk about the climate impacts of how plants respond to a changing climate. We talked so far about where those plants were growing, maybe what they did to the surface albedo. Now let's talk about the plant responses themselves. And so specifically, we're going to be thinking about some aspects of plant physiology. And this work was done with a number of collaborators. I'll show you some work led by Claire Zarakis, who's a grad student in my lab, but also work in collaboration with Charlie Coven, Jim Randerson, Forrest Hoffman, Gabe Cooperman, and Kyle Armour. So we're going to look at what plants are doing in response to climate and what the impacts of that are on climate itself. To get everyone oriented, I'm showing you this plot of the projected temperature increase associated with adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So these are two different scenarios for a future climate, the red one being a high emission scenario and the blue one being a very low emission scenario. The main point being the amount of temperature change we expect is directly related to the amount of greenhouse gases that we expect to add to the atmosphere. And the primary greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide. So more climate change, more carbon dioxide, essentially. And along with those changes in temperature due to increases in greenhouse gases, we expect many types of climate impacts. I'm going to talk a little bit today about drought. And droughts have been predicted to become more severe. This is a plot showing the Palmer Drought Severity Index at the end of the century under a high emission scenario relative to the beginning of the century. And you can see these red and pink and purple colors are showing very large increases in drought severity. So things becoming much, much drier on land. And it looks pretty dire. These are very large changes in this drought index, and they're happening over pretty widespread areas of land. But we wanted to take a step back from this and think about what's really going on with plants and what their role is. So we're going to think like a tree. So here's our tree again. Our tree has leaves. Our leaves have stomata. And recall that the flux of water out of the plant is tightly coupled to the flux of carbon dioxide into the plant because they're both regulated by the opening and closing of stomata on plants. So the plant takes carbon in while it lets water out. And so what controls the flux of water and carbon? Well, this is a common equation used to represent how stomata open and close. There are many formulations of equations like this. This is one example that's very common in climate models. And we represent the conductance across this stomata as a function of a linear function of the pink term, which is photosynthesis, the green term, carbon dioxide, and the blue term is, in this case, relative humidity. And so this is trying to capture the fact that we expect stomata to open more when plants are photosynthesizing a lot, to open more as the air is more humid, and to open less as carbon dioxide goes up. So why would they do that? Well, we can think about this cross section of a stomata. So we have on the bottom left a picture of a cross section of a leaf with a stomatal opening and an airspace inside the leaf. And so the plant has to diffuse carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the airspace inside the leaf and then into the tissues in order to be used in photosynthesis in the biochemistry. So CO2 has to get across that stomatal boundary and then into the plant tissues. And this is the same opening and closing is going to control how much water gets out. So if we consider a scenario where carbon dioxide increases outside the leaf, so now we have a higher concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, that gradient is a little bit bigger. It's a little bit easier to diffuse carbon across this stomatal boundary into the leaf. So all other things being equal, which they are not, but just to start with, if all other things are equal, then the stomata can close a little bit and the plant can flux the same amount of CO2 into the airspace in the leaf because the gradient is bigger. So the stomatal, that's why you would expect the stomatal conductance to close slightly as carbon dioxide increases if you hold all those other factors constant. And if you were to do that, to close the stomata slightly, you would expect the evaporation or the transpiration rate, the water going through the plant, to go down. So the stomata, again, are controlling both the carbon dioxide going in and the water vapor going out. A number of other things happen as plants experience higher CO2. We think that this could cause photosynthesis to increase, although there's reasons to believe there'd be limits to that, especially need enough available nutrients for plants to photosynthesize more. And this could lead to more leaf growth. So there's a number of uncertain processes involved in figuring out how much carbon you expect to go in and how much water you expect to go out. But our basic understanding of how stomata work is that they will care about the increase in carbon dioxide concentration because it increases that gradient and makes it a little bit easier to move CO2 across the stomatal opening. So if we come back and we think about what is the role of CO2 in the climate system here, well, increasing carbon dioxide has multiple effects. It has a radiative effect. That's what we're mostly used to thinking about. Oops, sorry. We've got a cat visitor here who just knocked a book off the table. So CO2 has a radiative effect, and that is what we're used to thinking about with the greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide makes Earth warmer. I'm showing a plot here. It's just plotted over land. It's obviously getting warmer everywhere, but this is a large increase in CO2 leads to a large increase in surface temperature. So that's kind of our most typical way of thinking about the role of CO2, but it also has these physiological effects. So CO2 is also going to influence how open stomata are. It's going to influence photosynthetic rates, and it's going to influence leaf area, has the potential to influence all of those things. So there's these physiological effects as well. So how do we figure out how much of each of these is responsible for changes in future climate? Well, we're going to use a series of experiments to separate the radiative and physiological effects of CO2. And this is work following on Pierre Sellers' paper from 1996, which is really showing the first evidence that changing stomatal behavior and changing plants could alter surface temperatures. And so he had a series of experiments like this. It turns out these experiments are also run as part of the CMIP model intercomparisons for a different purpose to look at carbon cycle feedbacks. And we're going to use them here to look at what's happening to water and some other physical climate variables. But we have the radiative effects of CO2. So we'll have an experiment where the atmosphere can see the CO2, but the plants can't. We'll have a separate experiment where the plants can see the CO2, but the atmosphere doesn't. And we'll have a third experiment where both the plants and the atmosphere see the CO2, and that's what we're typically used to seeing in a climate change scenario. And for all of these experiments, carbon dioxide is going to increase at 1% per year from pre-industrial up to a quadrupling. So it's going to go from 280 parts per million up to 1140. So we're looking over this big increase in CO2, and we're looking at how much change do you get just because of the greenhouse effect? How much change do you get because plants are able to respond physiologically? And then how do they combine together to give you the answer that we're typically looking at when we look at future climate projections? So I'm going to show you evapotranspiration over land to start with here. And what we're looking at across the x-axis is this increase in carbon dioxide from 280 to 1140. This is a multi-model mean for mid and low latitude land areas. So 45 south to 45 north over land. And we're looking at how much evapotranspiration changes as we increase carbon dioxide when just the greenhouse effect is happening. So there's only the atmosphere can see the CO2 changing. It changes the radiative, there's radiative impacts in the atmosphere. And associated with that, we see more evaporation. This makes sense. It gets hotter, you get more evaporation. There's more demand for evaporation from the atmosphere as the temperature increases. And we know that the greenhouse effect of CO2 should cause really big temperature increases by the time you get to a quadrupling. If we switch now and we look at the physiological effects on evapotranspiration over land, so this is just allowing the plants to see the CO2 increasing. We can see that the evapotranspiration goes down. So there's no greenhouse effect in this case. It's not getting necessarily much hotter, but plants are able to see the CO2. This allows them to adjust their stomata, adjust their photosynthesis, their leaf area, and we see that they are having less evapotranspiration. And so this is because stomata are closing. So as plants see more CO2, even though they're growing more leaves, they're closing their stomata even more than that. And so this results in less evapotranspiration overall. And when we look at these two things together, which again is what we're typically looking at in climate simulations, the combination shows maybe a slight decrease, but I would say relatively flat changes in evapotranspiration. This might depend on exactly which models you choose, whether you see this slight decrease or not. But the main takeaway is that these two things counteract each other. Hotter temperatures from the greenhouse effect make the evaporation go up. Plant stomatal closure makes the evaporation go down. And what you end up with is something kind of flat, basically not much change in evapotranspiration because the plants are responding. If they weren't responding, there'd be a big increase in evapotranspiration. Okay, so we've just been talking about evapotranspiration, the flux of water from the land to the atmosphere. How do we relate that back to droughts? Well, when we think about things like drought, we often think about the potential to evaporate water. How much demand does the atmosphere have to evaporate water? And so now I'm showing you this potential or the atmospheric demand. And this is really just looking at the surface energy budget and saying if there was lots of water available, how much water do we think would move from the land surface to the atmosphere? And this is now each model plotted out on its own, but you can see they all are basically increasing as carbon dioxide goes up. Its potential to evaporate water goes up because it's getting hotter from the greenhouse effect. But if we compare that to what this is calculated from climate model output, these same exact simulations, the actual evapotranspiration that these models simulate is pretty flat. So despite the fact that these models have the potential to evaporate water going up, the actual amount of water flux is not really changing. And that is, again, because the physiological response is counteracting this increase in atmospheric demand. And that matters because we use the potential to evaporate water as a part of a lot of climate impacts metrics. It's built into a lot of drought indices. It's built into a number of other hydrologic representations. And it's not reflecting the fact that plants are actually responding to a change in climate. So if we look specifically at drought, here's my plot of the Palmer Drought Severity Index for these same experiments. And we see that as we get a big increase in CO2, we get a big increase in drought severity. So these numbers go down, which means more severe drought. And you can see it again looks similar to the one we saw before. It's pretty ubiquitous. It's very dramatic. It looks very dire. If instead of looking at this drought severity index, which is based on the potential to evaporate water, if we look at the actual water budget in these simulations, like we know how much water they simulated losing, we can look at, say, precipitation minus evapotranspiration. We can see that it does not look nearly as dry. There are still places where it gets drier, but it's not as ubiquitous and it's not as dramatically severe in terms of the amount of water deficit that we expect on the land surface. And this pattern ends up reflecting more just the precipitation pattern. So maybe the robustness of exactly what this looks like is dependent on how confident we are in those patterns of precipitation change. But the takeaway being that because the evapotranspiration changes are very small, the water budget on land is really dictated by how we think precipitation will change and not exactly how we think evaporation will change. So this calls into question how we use those metrics and what aspects of plant response we've actually included in them. And I wanted to show you 3 more physical climate variables that are also influenced by plant responses, plant physiological responses to increasing CO2. The first one is relative humidity. This is showing relative humidity changes over land. And we see that about half of the relative humidity change on average is coming from plants closing their stomata. On the upper left, we have the radiative effect. So the greenhouse effect causing drier relative humidities over land. On the bottom, the physiological effects, and you can see those are particularly large in places that have a lot of plant productivity, where you would get a big closure, big stomatal closure, which would lead to a lot less water getting into the near surface atmosphere. And on the right, we have the combination of all those things together, which is again what we're used to looking at. But this calls into question, how do you think about the role of the land surface in setting the relative humidity over land? And how it's able to maybe trigger these patterns of dry conditions in the atmosphere, in the physical atmosphere. We also see impacts on precipitation. So this is a paper led by Gabe Cooperman, where he looked at tropical precipitation. Same setup here with the greenhouse effect or radiative effects of CO2 in the upper left, the physiological effects of CO2 on the bottom left, and the combination of those two on the right. And you can see that the radiative effects and the physiological effects are both contributing to the total change in rainfall in the tropics. In particular, we see the physiological effects are contributing to wetting over Indonesia and drying over South America, which is the same process is causing both of those. And on my very simplified explanation of it, you should go read the paper. But the stomatal closure leads to less latent heat flux and more sensible heat flux. That extra sensible heat flux over Indonesia drives more uplift of air, which leads to more rainfall. But over the Amazon, when you have less evapotranspiration, less latent heat flux, you have less water to resupply precipitation. And so it cuts off the precipitation recycling over the Amazon, which leads to a decrease in precipitation. But they're both driven by stomatal closure. Okay, so relative humidity, tropical precipitation, and finally, bring it back around to temperature. I'm showing you now a different version of this radiative impact of CO2. This is now using some CMIP6 simulations, looking at just a doubling of CO2. And we can see this is what the greenhouse effect from 12 CMIP6 models looks like, just due to the radiative effect of CO2. And we can compare that to the temperature effect from the physiological response. So there's not zero temperature change when plant stomata can respond. We actually see a little bit of warming over land, and it looks small relative to the radiative effect of CO2, but it's actually not insignificant. And so we can diagnose the physiological contribution to the total warming at a doubling of CO2. And it's up to 20% of the warming in some places over land is due just to this physiological response of plants. So it's locally quite important. We also quantified how much it contributes to the transient climate sensitivity, somewhere in the order of 6 to 8%. Some models much higher. So again, that's a small component of transient climate sensitivity, but it's still a non-negligible component. It actually contributes more to the uncertainty across models than its total size as well. But the biggest point I would like to make here is that, so there's this contribution to warming over land that's coming from the plant responses to CO2. But these plant responses are actually really uncertain. We don't understand the proper balance between how much photosynthesis will change, how much stomata will respond, how much leaf area will respond. We're doing our best to represent what we do understand about that, but it's highly uncertain. And those things trade off against each other. So it's hard to even know if we're in the right place exactly. But this uncertainty is typically not accounted for in uncertainty of things like temperature, drought, or other physical climate metrics. So I think it's taken for granted that there is this plant, or perhaps ignored that there's a plant signal in there, and that although Earth system models might have one way of representing what those plant signals are, we actually aren't particularly confident in exactly what size those should be. And for people who think about the carbon cycle side of things, I like to think about this: the carbon cycle uncertainty does not stay in the carbon cycle. It's also impacting all these physical climate properties. So to summarize this part of the talk, the climate impacts depend on the plant responses to climate. The potential evapotranspiration is unstable relative to the actual evapotranspiration as CO2 changes, and this is because plants are responding. So we have to be very thoughtful, very careful in predicting impacts using metrics that ignore plant responses, even if those plant responses are uncertain. And so I don't have a magic answer for exactly what index you should use to represent any future climate impacts, other than to say that we should be really aware of what assumptions we've made about what plants are doing, and if that's the appropriate assumption to make, if we're including those plant responses, or if we've ignored them and therefore assumed they were zero. And finally, even these atmospheric variables can have a large influence from the plant responses to climate change. And so we can't ignore the plants just because we aren't thinking about the carbon cycle or interested in the ecosystems themselves. So bringing it back around to the big picture question of where and how plants influence climate. I've talked today about how a change in climate is due to a change in plants is a function of the magnitude of plant change, the location, the plant type. These land surface changes are magnified by the atmosphere. The coupled system is really important for understanding what the impact of the land surface is, and that these physiological responses of plants can alter physical climate properties on the land surface. And we really need to be thoughtful about how we include those plant responses in our understanding of projections for future climate. So it's critical to include these plant responses and be thoughtful about them. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby. If we could do a virtual clap. That was a great talk. If anyone has a question they would like to ask, feel free to unmute yourself and ask now, or you can drop it in the chat and I can ask for you. Looks like we've got a question from John.
Yeah, Abby, thank you. Really great talk. It's in a field that I know almost nothing about, and I was really excited about everything you said. I had a comment. I'll get back to my original one about, I think you could extend all of your work to understanding what the circulation characteristics are of the polar and subtropical jets in either hemisphere. It'd be really interesting to know that with the same tools. And then I noticed that Amazonia gets drier, as you pointed out, when it gets warmer. I think that was what it was, but it's like there's a very small, it's not a watershed, but like a vapor shed. The region that contributes to precipitation in Amazonia is really small. It's local, and but it doesn't seem to be true in the Congo. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, good question. So I'll start with the first one by saying Marisa Legault has been looking a lot into these circulation responses. She's been doing a postdoc with Bill Booth at Berkeley and has some nice work that's either in review or near to be submitted on a lot more aspects of circulation change due to changes in surface albedo and evaporative resistance. So she's working in that space for sure. in terms of why we see this big impact from a drop in evaporation over the Amazon, but not over the Congo. You're right, we get more impact from the the cutting off of precipitation recycling over the Amazon. And that just, I don't have a great answer from the Congo other than saying I think that's consistent also with the idea of how much precipitation recycling is occurring in the Congo. The region is smaller. There was also in that paper some, there's definitely a more robust response across the Amazon, across models.
Thanks.
And it looked like we also had a question from Matt.
Hi, yeah, I'm Matt Hitchman. That was a really interesting talk. You know how people tend to control where plants are, increasingly, where plants are planted. Is there a concerted effort to try to anticipate over the next 100 years what fraction of the plant response will be natural versus like people will control each square meter? I really don't know about that.
That's a good question. I don't know if there's been an organized response to that. In terms of like getting towards answering that question, I've just been really trying to think about, well, you know, where does it matter? Where does it matter what kind of plants are growing there or not? There are associated with future climate projections. Each of those future emission scenarios comes with it a set of land use change maps in terms of where they have, so there's an economic model associated with each of those emissions trajectories, not the ones I've been showing here, but other ones you would typically see in terms of like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Those economic models have associated with them expected changes in land use. So they've predicted where and what crops they think will be grown, and also what would be used for biofuel. So there are, there's a whole land use MIP as part of the CMIP process where they're looking at the impacts of the land use change in the past and in the future. A lot of that work has been done with the land surface in isolation from the atmosphere. So just looking at how the land surface responds, and some of what we've been finding is we really think that that's not sufficient for understanding the role of the land surface in climate.
Thanks. I was trying to think of a joke of stomata. Let's call this global warming thing off. Sorry.
It looks like we had another question from Karen Russ in the chat. She's wondering about the plot on energy transport from the northern to southern hemisphere versus trees. And our question is, why do you think it plateaus or decreases a little in the middle?
I don't have a great answer for you there. I think Marisa has dug into this more with additional simulation. She's been looking a lot at the moistatic energy gradients that are set up by changing the land surface, and we really expect the circulation response to be in response to those moistatic energy gradients. So I'm a little unsure if that explains. I don't know that we went back and reanalyzed those older runs to see if that helps explain why it didn't uniformly, you know, monotonically increase. But I think the idea is consistent that the albedo should cause a gradient in energy, and that gradient in energy is then driving the shift in the circulation.
It looks like we've got a question from Angela.
Hi, Abby.
Hello.
I have a more specific question that you didn't exactly address, but your talk made me think of. With all the beetle kill in the west of the US, like what scale of impact has that had, or would it have, or is it too small in time and space? I'm just kind of curious if you've looked into that or know kind of that impact.
Great question. I don't know yet, but I am actively trying to set up simulations to look at that. I think your intuition is right. It could be too small. And so what we're trying to do is set up, so a lot of the stuff we do in my group is kind of theoretical, like let's just paint a paintbrush over this and see what the impacts are. We're actually trying to set up simulations that look as much like the real pattern of beetle kill as possible, so we can hypothesize what those impacts really were and then look for them in observations. And I think this is going to be really challenging to actually find, but I figured we had to try. So we're basically trying to test to see if we could observe the impacts of the tree cover change. And the reason we're looking at the beetle kill is because we came up with sort of two more modern case studies where we thought there was enough forest change that maybe we had a chance of seeing the signal. And so beetle kill in the Western US, which happens over the scale of a decade or two, is one, and deforestation in the Amazon is another one. So I hope to have some kind of answer. It might be a disappointing answer that the signal is small and we can't really identify it, but we are trying to isolate that and see if we can identify what that impact would have been. There is a nice paper by Holly Manis where she looks at the local temperature change in a beetle killed area and response to a drop in evapotranspiration. So using some satellite metrics to like see, okay, this is the estimated drop in ET and we see an associated increase in temperature. So more of that surface energy budget definitely matters locally.
Thank you.
So we've got another question in the chat from Matthew Garcia, wondering if you've experimented with different tree types in the forested band, such as evergreen and mixed instead of just deciduous. That was a question I had as well.
Yeah. Probably. I can't recall exactly what happened differently in those scenarios, but one of the reasons we chose a broadleafed tree for those experiments is because there had been a number of people who looked, say, at boreal forests or high latitude forests, which are predominantly needle leaf. And it really seems like the albedo ends up mattering at the higher latitudes. And we were curious at the lower latitudes where there might be this trade-off between evapotranspiration and change in surface albedo. So if you put in a darker tree, then you're going to sort of push it more towards the albedo being important. So instead of running those simulations like with a different tree, what I'd say I would look at Marisa's work where we just change the surface albedo and try to think about, okay, if you have this much more increment of surface albedo change and this kind of increment in evaporative resistance change, what would we expect those results to be?
Awesome, thank you. And it looks like we had another question from Dan Fremont.
Hi, Abby. Thanks so much for a really interesting talk. I was also wondering about the plateauing of the latent heat flux. I guess the two questions I had, one, can you explain why it plateaus? And then also, my assumption on that is that with the loss of moisture, that means that and don't get me wrong, I think that means that the tree change is inconsistent with the lack of moisture in the first place. But which doesn't negate anything. It's still, I just am curious as to understanding the processes there.
Sure. Yeah, no, good question. So the basic idea is like, one, how could you have the trees if you didn't have enough extra water? And does that make sense to even put the trees there in the first place? Well, and then two, why does it plateau?
Yeah. The first one I think is a little more interesting. Yeah, the second one is just maybe a consequence of that.
Yeah, right. So, well, there's two pieces. There's one, which is, can you get rid of all that extra energy that came in from making the surface darker through latent heat flux? And so what we found is that at some point the system runs out of water, meaning it doesn't have enough extra water to get rid of all that extra energy. That doesn't actually tell us whether the tree was stressed by lack of water, but it's a totally valid point to say that trees might not really survive in some of these places that we've put them in the climate model. But we would need a different metric to say whether the plant actually had enough water to survive, which would be different than did it have enough water to get rid of all of the extra energy. Yeah, and it's possible the tree could heat up a bit and still have enough water to make it.
Yeah, and that's what I'm wondering, like where I'm trying to reconcile this with the hydrological budget. That so at some point, does runoff go to zero, or where's the moisture? Like, how does that couple in with the hydrological budget?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I'd expect runoff to go all the way to zero, but essentially, yes, you're diverting more of the runoff into evapotranspiration, so the runoff should go down.
Okay.
And runoff is another piece of how to diagnose. Well, another thing we should expect would be impacted by plant physiology as well, because if you're diverting, say, less water into ET because the stomata are closing, you should be diverting more of it into runoff. It's not, there's time lags and other issues with the soil, but basically, that over time, some amount of time, the water budget should balance.
Got it. Okay, that's what I think. That I was trying to figure out where the moisture was, what was limiting that. So thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got another question from Gabe Bromley in the chat, and we'll probably call this the last one so you can get a little bit of a break before the grad student meeting. Gabe is wondering, he says, there are studies that show the precipitation response to land surface changes can reverse signs based on whether convection is parameterized versus explicitly simulated. Given some of the areas you show to be changing are predominantly convective, have you looked into these effects in relation to these afforestation experiments?
Ooh, okay, so I don't know if you're thinking of the tropical cases as being the convective ones or the mid-latitudes. I have not looked at the mid-latitude simulations, so adding all the trees to the mid-latitudes. We haven't looked at that in any kind of convection permitting model, although I think that Marisa is definitely interested in those things. I don't know if she's made progress on that lately. But we definitely do see cloud responses, and so it'd be really good to question if those cloud responses are the cloud responses that we expect. Do we think that those were well represented? The tropical precipitation responding to the stomatal closure, Gabe Cooperman has done some work with a super parameterized version of CAM and finds some similar responses. So I think that one appears to hold up pretty well. But as with many of these things, we're doing something somewhat theoretical, and I feel like it's a really good for forming hypotheses that then tend to need further testing. So it suggests the atmosphere is really critical. Instead of giving you the exact map of exactly where I think it's going to happen, I think it suggests that we need to dig into like, okay, well, under this scenario, the model is doing a good job representing the cloud cover. So that response is well represented. Maybe somewhere else it's less well represented.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Abby, for such a great talk. This was really interesting. Just as a reminder to the grad students on the call, we're having a group meeting at 4:45 for 30 minutes. So if you'd like to hop on that, I sent the link out on Friday and it's in the Slack as well. So thank you again, and we'll see you in a few minutes.